When Queen Latifah stepped onto the set of Living Single, she brought more than performance energy. There was a quiet intensity behind her presence, something shaped by personal experience, discipline, and a deep understanding of what the show represented. On screen, everything felt effortless. The chemistry, the humor, the rhythm of conversation, it all looked natural. But behind that ease was a growing tension that few viewers ever noticed. The show wasn't just another sitcom. It carried cultural weight, even if it wasn't always acknowledged as such at the time. What made things more complex was that this pressure didn't come from within the cast or writers. It came from the environment surrounding the show. There were expectations, comparisons, and unspoken rules shaping how far the series could go. And somewhere in the middle of that evolving landscape, a single moment, subtle but powerful, began to shift how the show was perceived behind closed doors. It didn't make headlines. It didn't cause public controversy. But internally, it marked a turning point that would quietly influence everything that followed. When Living Single first aired, it didn't rely on spectacle or exaggerated storytelling to grab attention. Instead, it built its identity on something far more grounded: authenticity. The show followed 6 Black professionals navigating life in Brooklyn, balancing friendships, careers, relationships, and personal growth. At the center of it all was Khadijah James, portrayed by Queen Latifah, a character who felt fully realized in a way television rarely allowed at the time. She wasn't written to be palatable or simplified. She was confident, driven, occasionally flawed, and entirely in control of her own narrative. This alone set the show apart. It didn't feel like it was explaining itself to anyone. It simply existed, trusting viewers to connect with it. And they did. Audiences didn't just watch Living Single, they recognized themselves in it. The humor came from real-life situations, not forced punchlines. The conversations felt lived in, not scripted for effect. It was a show that respected its audience's intelligence, and in return, it earned loyalty. Not explosive ratings, but something more enduring, consistent engagement and emotional investment. The success of Living Single wasn't built overnight, and that was part of its strength. It grew steadily, episode by episode, building a connection with viewers who appreciated its tone and honesty. But while it was establishing itself, the television landscape began to shift. The arrival of Friends introduced a new kind of attention to the same format: 6 friends navigating city life. Suddenly, comparisons became unavoidable. On the surface, the similarities seemed obvious. But beneath that, the differences were significant. One show was treated as universally relatable, while the other was subtly categorized as niche. That distinction mattered more than it should have. It influenced how networks invested resources, how shows were promoted, and how they were prioritized internally. Living Single didn't lose its audience, but it began to lose something else: momentum within the system. The enthusiasm that once surrounded it started to cool. And with that shift came changes that were less visible but deeply impactful. As the industry's focus shifted, Living Single began to experience a quieter form of pressure. It wasn't about ratings alone, it was about perception. The show was no longer just evaluated for its quality, but for how well it fit within a broader television narrative being shaped at the time. Creative decisions that once felt natural were now being scrutinized. Scripts were reviewed more carefully, not necessarily to improve them, but to ensure they aligned with expectations coming from outside the creative team. The tone became a focal point. Moments that felt too real, too layered, or too emotionally honest were flagged, not because they were ineffective, but because they didn't fit a safer, more controlled version of storytelling. This shift didn't happen all at once. It unfolded gradually, almost invisibly. But for those involved in the show, it was unmistakable. The space that once allowed for creative freedom was becoming increasingly narrow. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere began to change. What had once been a collaborative environment started to feel more cautious. Conversations between writers, actors, and producers became more measured. Decisions were no longer driven purely by storytelling instincts, but by considerations that weren't always clearly defined. There was an unspoken understanding that certain boundaries were tightening. Risk, whether emotional, thematic, or narrative, was no longer encouraged in the same way. And for a show that had built its identity on honesty, that shift carried weight. It affected how scenes were written, how performances were delivered, and how stories unfolded. The creative process became less about expression and more about navigation, figuring out how to maintain the show's voice while avoiding unseen limits. For Queen Latifah, this period overlapped with deeply personal challenges. Off-screen, she was dealing with grief and trauma that shaped her perspective and influenced her work. Her performance as Khadija carried a depth that went beyond the script. It wasn't just acting. It was channeling real emotion into a character who already represented strength and independence. This added layer made her portrayal even more powerful, but it also made the external pressure more difficult to ignore. She wasn't interested in softening the character to fit expectations. For her, authenticity wasn't negotiable. And that stance, while admirable, placed her in a complicated position within a system that was increasingly prioritizing control over truth. As the seasons progressed, Living Single found itself in a delicate position. It was still successful, still loved by its audience, but it was also navigating a growing disconnect between its creative identity and the expectations being placed upon it. This tension reached a subtle but significant moment during one particular scene. There was nothing overtly controversial about it. No explicit content, no shocking dialogue, but the tone was different. The conversation felt raw, unresolved, and deeply real. It didn't wrap itself in humor or soften its edges. It simply existed as an honest exchange between characters. And that honesty created discomfort, not for viewers, but for those evaluating the show from a distance. The reaction to that scene wasn't immediate or public. There were no headlines, no statements. But internally, it shifted the atmosphere. The room reportedly felt different during filming. The usual ease was replaced by a quiet awareness that something had crossed an invisible line. It wasn't about what was said, it was about what it represented. The show had stepped into a space that wasn't easily controlled or categorized. And in an industry built on predictability, that kind of unpredictability can be unsettling. What made the moment significant wasn't its content, but its impact. It revealed how fragile creative freedom could be when it challenged unspoken boundaries. Following that moment, the changes became more noticeable. Network feedback increased, becoming more frequent and more specific. Notes focused heavily on tone, encouraging a shift toward something safer and more broadly appealing. Characters were adjusted, dialogue softened, and storylines reshaped. None of these changes were dramatic on their own, but together, they altered the show's rhythm. The authenticity that once defined Living Single began to feel slightly restrained. It wasn't lost entirely, but it was being carefully managed. This shift affected the entire cast differently. Some adapted, understanding the realities of television production and the importance of longevity. Others found it more challenging. The writers, in particular, faced the task of balancing creative integrity with external expectations. Scenes that once felt natural now required reconsideration. Dialogue was revised not because it lacked quality, but because it carried a tone that might be perceived as risky. The definition of too much became increasingly unclear, yet consistently enforced. One of the more visible outcomes of this shift was the gradual change in character focus. Storylines evolved, but not always in ways that felt organic. Certain characters began to receive less attention, their arcs becoming less defined. These changes weren't explained within the narrative, but they reflected decisions being made behind the scenes. The show was still functioning, still producing episodes, but its internal balance had shifted. For Queen Latifah, the experience was layered. On one hand, she remained committed to the role and the show's legacy. On the other, she could sense the limitations becoming more pronounced. The support that once felt consistent now seemed less certain. It wasn't about direct criticism, but about subtle signals, the absence of advocacy, the presence of restraint. These changes didn't disrupt the show immediately, but they contributed to a growing sense of instability. As time went on, the show entered a phase that many series experience but rarely acknowledge openly. It wasn't canceled abruptly. Instead, it began to lose the resources and attention that sustain long-term success. Budgets tightened, promotional efforts decreased, and scheduling became less favorable. These shifts weren't dramatic, but they were significant. They signaled a change in priority. Episodes continued to air, but the energy behind them felt different. Long-term storytelling gave way to shorter, less connected narratives. The sense of progression that had once defined the show began to fade. It wasn't a creative failure, it was a structural one. The framework supporting the show was no longer as strong as it had been. For the cast and crew, this period required adjustment. There was an understanding that the show was approaching its end, even if it hadn't been formally announced. The focus shifted from building something lasting to maintaining what remained. It was a quiet transition, marked more by absence than action. When the final episode aired, it did so without the recognition many felt the show deserved. There was no major celebration, no extensive reflection on its impact. It ended as it had been treated in its later years, subtly, without emphasis. For those who had followed it from the beginning, the ending felt smaller than the journey. In the years that followed, the perception of living single began to change. Audiences revisited the show with a new perspective, recognizing elements that had been overlooked. The writing, the performances, and the cultural significance became more apparent with time. Streaming platforms and social media played a role in this reevaluation. New audiences discovered the show, while longtime viewers saw it through a more critical lens. The authenticity that once created tension was now celebrated as a strength. For Queen Latifah, the legacy of the show became part of a larger career that continued to evolve. She moved into film and other projects, carrying with her the lessons learned during that time. The experience shaped her approach to storytelling and creative control. Looking back, Living Single stands as more than just a sitcom. It represents a moment in television where authenticity challenged structure. The scene that once caused discomfort now feels like a reflection of the show's core strength. It wasn't about crossing a line, it was about revealing where that line existed. And in doing so, it left behind a legacy that continues to resonate, long after the final episode faded from the screen.